Kayla, if you would go ahead. All right. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Sarah Cushman, a distinguished scholar and educator in Holocaust studies. Dr. Cushman serves as the director of the Holocaust Education Foundation of Northwestern University and is a senior lecturer in the Department of History. With nearly 2 decades of experience in Holocaust education, her work has significantly advanced the field to both scholarship and teaching. Her research focuses on women's experiences during the Holocaust, particularly in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and she's currently authoring a book. Sarah, make sure I get this right. The title "Women in Auschwitz" with Indiana University Press. And her contributions have been recognized through several fellowships, including the United States Holocaust Museum and the Brandeis Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sarah Cushman.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen here and we'll get going. Oh, let me see. It looks like I've got 2. Okay, here we go. Hey, everybody, can you all see that? Yes, no, I'm going to assume that you can. And can you hear me? Can you hear me and see everything?
So I think we've got the screen. We're looking at your the presenter view on your slide.
Oh, okay. Let me see. Let me do the other one. How's that? Better?
Let's see. Yeah, that's perfect. That's it.
Okay, great. Terrific. Thanks. Thanks for your patience. My technological challenges. One of the things I'm not an expert in is technology. Anyways, good afternoon. It's really a privilege to be with you. And thank you to Stephen for the invitation to be here. And I really appreciate all of you for caring about this devastating topic and your willingness to spend some time learning more about it and, of course, teaching about it. Please allow me just a few minutes to discuss the work of the organization I lead. The Holocaust Educational Foundation of Northwestern University was founded in 1976 by Holocaust survivor Theodore Zev Weiss. Our mission is to advance Holocaust education at the university level around the world. We host the biennial North American Lessons and Legacies Conference. We also sponsor every 4 years a European Lessons and Legacies Conference. And just later this year, we'll be hosting our first ever Emerging Scholars Lessons and Legacies Conference. Each year, we also offer competitions for teaching and research grants, a 2-week intensive summer institute on the Holocaust and Jewish civilization, and several regional institutes. We also offer a virtual mentorship program and a virtual speakers bureau. As I mentioned, most of these programs are for university level instructors, but I do encourage you to take a look at our virtual speakers bureau, as that may be something of use to you in your classrooms. For more information, please visit our website, HEF at Northwest, sorry, that's our email, hef.northwestern.edu. And feel free to follow us on social media as well. Okay, now to our talk today. Oops, let me see. Doesn't want to go forward. Hold on one moment. There we go. So scholars now understand that at least as many Jews were murdered at close range by mobile killing squads as were murdered in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and other Nazi death camps. Still, Auschwitz evokes industrialized mass murder and stands as a symbol of the Nazi genocide. Its history has been examined from multiple angles, but few know about the women's section. The Auschwitz Women's Camp was a dynamic place in which women of all stripes shaped their lives in what few ways they could for the 2 3/4 years of the camp's existence. 3 broad categories of women lived and worked in the women's camp. The most powerful were women affiliated with the Nazi camp administration. The largest group of women was that which encompassed the array of prisoners, Jewish and Gentile alike, who engaged in a daily struggle to survive the deadly conditions in Auschwitz. The third group was comprised of prisoner functionaries. Elisa Rothova had been crammed into a closed boxcar for 2 days with little food, no water, and an understanding that she and her companions, all young Jewish women from Eastern Slovakia, were being sent to a labor camp. On March 26, 1942, the doors are opening and the SS men are waiting. "Where are we?" she said. No one proffered an answer to her question. Forced to jump from the rail cars to the ground and to leave behind the little they had brought with them, the women marched a short distance through the gates and into the main camp of Auschwitz. It was her first day in Auschwitz, and it was the day of the founding of the women's camp there. And I think you all heard quite a bit about the first transport yesterday morning. So that was March 26, 1942. And at that time, Hitler had been in power for 9 years, since January of 1933. World War II had been underway for over 2.5 years, since September of 1939. The Auschwitz camp had existed for nearly 2 years, since July of 1940. And the Nazi policy towards the Jews of Europe had been genocide for several months only, since June, somewhere between June and September of 1941. In addition, Auschwitz had not yet become a central location for the genocide. That would happen a bit later. I would like to spend a few minutes orienting you to Auschwitz and women's places within it. Auschwitz sat in what is now Poland, but at the time was the eastern reaches of the German Reich. Himmler envisioned Auschwitz, this is Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, envisioned Auschwitz as a prototypical Nazi town for which he needed an abundance of labor. This explains, in part, the size of the complex. Eventually, it also became the center of the Holocaust, which happened in 1943. Auschwitz was founded in July of 1940, and from then until the establishment of the women's camp in March 1942, housed primarily Polish Gentile men. The history of the women's camp entwines with that of the entire camp complex, but has its own timeline that falls into 5 stages based primarily on where most women prisoners lived and worked. Women dwelled in different parts of the Auschwitz complex, including the staff building near the main camp and several agricultural subcamps, Bobrek, Budi, Harmense, Plavi, and Raisko, within the Auschwitz zone of interest, which you can see on this map of the Auschwitz zone of interest. Original plans for the women's section placed it in the subcamp of Birkenau, which was to house thousands of laborers to construct the area around Auschwitz. When construction ran behind schedule, the SS built a wall separating blocks 1 to 10 of the Auschwitz main camp to contain women. Initially, the only women prisoners sent to Auschwitz were laborers. Transports comprised of Jewish children, elderly, and others began to arrive soon thereafter. Those the Nazis deemed unsuited for labor were murdered in improvised gas chambers using the deadly efficient Zyklon B insecticide. During this early period, the SS began construction of 4 large crematoria in Birkenau. These are crematoria numbered 2 through 5. In August 1942, women prisoners were moved to Birkenau Section B1A. That's in the in this section here on the bottom right, where conditions already deadly deteriorated. Massive selections characterized not only the initial relocation, but also several months following. During each, thousands of women prisoners, Jewish and Gentile, were murdered in the gas chambers. There were improvised gas chambers at this point in time. Following a selection in February, Gentile prisoners were no longer subject to gas chamber selections. In the first half of 1943, the 4 Birkenau crematoria became operational. July 1943 saw the expansion of the women's camp into all of Section B1. So that's all of this area here that's south of the main ramp, which actually wasn't built until 1944. And that remained its primary location for the next year. Around this time, the Operation Reinhardt camps, those were Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, began to close. Intended for the annihilation of Polish Jewry, they had begun operation at various times throughout 1942. By summer of 1943, over 90% of Jews in Poland had been murdered. Auschwitz became the sole Nazi murder camp. Majdanek was on and offline here and there over the next couple of years. Most Jews, about 90% that arrived in Auschwitz, were killed without ever being registered in the camp. For those admitted as prisoners, conditions remained deplorable and claimed the lives of most within several months. I just wanted to show you a couple of the details of some of the local subcamps. You can see them here. Babitz, Budi, and some of the other local subcamps as well. These are all places where women either worked and or resided when they were in Auschwitz. In early 1944, Hungary, an ally of Germany, pursued a separate peace with the Allies, prompting German occupation. Hungary had persecuted its Jewish citizens but had not deported them. With German occupation, thousands of Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz. This became the busiest period in Birkenau's history of mass murder. But labor remained a priority, and some Jews were kept alive to serve the Nazis. Um, to serve the Nazis. Um, Shortly after this dramatic increase in the size of the camp, which accompanied the influx of Hungarian Jews, there was a dramatic decrease in the camp as well. As the summer ended, the women's camp contracted quickly. Many women prisoners were transferred to camps inside Germany, and others were annihilated. The Camp SS began to destroy evidence or use prisoners to destroy evidence. They dismantled the crematoria and burned administrative records. Most prisoners were forced to evacuate the camp on foot early on January 19th, 1945. They marched for 3 days to Gleiwitz and other locations where open train cars transported them to camps inside Germany. I'm talking about women prisoners here. The Soviets reached Auschwitz on 27th of January to find 7,000 debilitated prisoners, remnants of the crematoria, thousands of surviving documents, and warehouses full of items stolen from murdered Jews. While the women's camp ceased to exist, the history of the women's camp did not end with the liberation of Auschwitz. For survivors, their experiences continued with internment in other camps and liberation. They faced the horror of learning how many family members had perished, sought to reassemble lives in destroyed homes or displaced persons camps, watched or took part in post-war crimes trials, relocated to new countries, and began to learn to live in foreign lands. All this while building new families and communities and battling lifelong trauma among a host of other issues and challenges. This history also continues with the fact that women's experiences in Auschwitz have gone unrecognized in much of the historiography. I'm going to turn now to the women who worked for the SS in the camp. In Auschwitz, women affiliated with the SS, the Schutzstaffel, this is the organization led by Himmler, supported and participated in the Nazi vision of European domination. The SS brought 4 groups of women to the Auschwitz complex. Guards, called Aufseherinnen, communications specialists, known as Helferinnen or literally auxiliaries, nurses, so Schwestern, and wives, SS wives. Between the founding of the camp in 1940 and its evacuation in 1945. The first 3 groups of women filled official camp functions working for the SS. The largest group of SS-affiliated women in Auschwitz were guards. The first group arrived in Auschwitz from Ravensbrück on the 26th of March, 1942, the day that the women's camp was founded. Women guards stood at the bottom of the SS hierarchy, but held almost absolute power inside the women's section. Violence from women guards permeated the lives of women prisoners. Paula Singer, a Jewish survivor from Poland, experienced violence immediately upon her arrival. At my arrival at Auschwitz, I was beaten so terribly that from that time on I tried to avoid beating, and at the very sight of Aufseherins, I ran far away because I wanted to live. Violence took numerous forms. Gertrude Diamant, a survivor from Czechoslovakia, recalled of a particular woman guard. I have seen her when in charge of large working parties beating women and girls with a stick. Her favorite habit was to beat them until they fell to the ground, and then she kicked them as hard as she could with her heavy boots. The Auschwitz Camp Command believed dogs particularly useful for guarding women prisoners. Johanna Bormann, a middle-aged woman from Birkenfelde, became notorious for attacking prisoners with her guard dog. Aufseherinnen deliberately prolonged daily roll calls as a method of torture. Already debilitated prisoners suffered simply from the effort to remain upright and in formation while exhausted and starving. Any hint of weakness could result in additional abuse, such as making sport. Helena Klein, a Polish Jewish woman, described this form of mistreatment. It was falling down and getting up and crawling, and the speed was increased all the time. Aufseherinnen also participated in the activity most feared by prisoners, selections of prisoners deemed unfit for labor who were dispatched to the gas chambers. Several types of selections took place, those upon arrival, full camp selections, daily roll call selections, and infirmary selections. Initially, the SS recruited women guards in traditional ways, advertising the job as an attractive career with excellent pay. The only prerequisites were general physical fitness and having no history of criminality. Recruitment remained a problem throughout the war, eventually prompting the SS to conscript women. They pulled new matrons primarily from supervisory roles in factories throughout German-dominated Europe, trained them, typically at Ravensbrück, and returned them to supervise prisoner workers. Ravensbrück was the first major camp for women in Germany and became a training center for women guards. Training included review of camp regulations, how to detect misbehavior and prevent escapes, and the parameters for punishment. Most women guards were young, unmarried women who had received only a primary education. Typically, there were between 40 and 70 stationed at Auschwitz at any one time. Various German institutions, including the SS, utilized women auxiliaries in administrative roles to replace men called to the front. SS auxiliaries were trained in telephone, radio, and telegraph operation. Recruited from SS families and Nazi women's organizations, SS auxiliaries were viewed as a racially elite group of potential partners for SS men. SS men and women demonstrated a deep commitment to a racialist future and their participation in it. At the National Auxiliary School in Alsace, SS auxiliaries received 6 weeks of general training, including Nazi indoctrination, followed by 6 to 12 weeks of specialized training. Survivor testimony does not mention these SS auxiliaries. There's little evidence that Helferinnen interacted with prisoners at all. These women had neither the opportunity did not have the opportunity to be violent in their service to Nazi Germany. We've learned from the abundant research on desk murderers that violence is not required to demonstrate complicity in the project of genocide. SS auxiliaries' critical bureaucratic and administrative positions at Auschwitz, their knowledge of its function, and their demonstrated support for and investment in Nazi racist ideology implicate these women. Their participation has been overshadowed by the violence of women guards, but SS auxiliaries were committed members of a genocidal cadre. German and Austrian nurses staffed infirmaries for the SS in Auschwitz. They treated camp personnel for a range of typical illness and injury. SS nurses seem not to have participated in human medical experiments carried out by SS doctors on inmates. Nurses chosen from among the prisoner population comprised support staff for those projects. Still, these women, the SS nurses, cared for SS personnel who operated the genocidal enterprise. It is likely that all nurses were aware of the murderous purposes of Auschwitz. The primary infirmary was located directly outside the main camp. A second infirmary opened in September of 1944 near Birkenau. The bulk of nurses thus worked near the main camp, where thousands of Polish male prisoners were housed, and very near to Crematorium 1, which, though used only briefly for murdering Jews, allowed nurses to see prisoners, selections, and general camp conditions. In the SS infirmary, nurses must have interacted with SS men on a regular basis. Nurses in other contexts described SS men as speaking openly about their participation in genocide. While required to sign an oath of secrecy, Auschwitz nurses were not conscripted and could request transfer. Their service was voluntary. Apart from National Socialist nurses, they may not have received Nazi indoctrination, although the culture of nursing and the pervasive anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany may have influenced their attitudes. Other than with male Polish Gentile prisoners who also worked in the SS infirmary, nurses had little interaction with Auschwitz prisoners. In the very early months of the women's camp, some nurses worked in the prisoner infirmary there inside the women's section. One nurse who was involved with camp resistance described another nurse as having hit starving, weakened women with a whip, which suggests that some nurses were committed National Socialists or that they viewed prisoners as worthy of mistreatment. The SS eventually prohibited nurses from tending to prisoners inside the camp. So in other words, most nurses during most of the time that the women's section was in existence had no or little interaction with women prisoners. Nurses, however, seem to have worked efficiently to care for SS personnel and their families. Like other women camp personnel, they were an essential part of the operation of the camp. Some SS wives accompanied their husbands to Holocaust sites throughout German-occupied Europe, including Auschwitz. Some scholars have found that cohabitation with wife and family provided SS men with support, love, and retreat from the stresses of mass murder that permitted, and this support and love and sort of retreat permitted SS men to continue with their consciences clean. But SS wives seem also to have participated actively in establishing Auschwitz as a German city, enjoying their elite status as occupiers, using it to exploit locals and prisoners, and to amass financial and material wealth. SS households could utilize labor of conscripted civilians, Polish civilians in the area, and camp inmates. They employed male prisoners for heavy work, including gardening, construction, supply delivery, and things like that. They employed local Polish girls and women prisoners, usually Jehovah's Witnesses, for cleaning, cooking, sewing, and childcare. SS wives treated civilian domestic workers in a variety of ways. Some shared housework and childcare responsibilities, included domestic workers and daily meals, gifted them with items they could not otherwise obtain, treated them with respect, paid them, permitted them, and these were mostly young women or girls, to visit their families on weekends, and may even have harbored some affection for them. Others burdened domestic workers with all household tasks, did not feed them, or fed them less than they fed the family and separately, or did not pay them or allow them to visit home. Beatings seem to have been uncommon. Civilian domestic workers observed the relationship between SS men and their wives. They saw some relationships characterized by affection and joy, others rendered by abuse, alcoholism, and infidelity on the part of one or both spouses. They also saw that some SS couples pilfered goods confiscated from incoming transports of Jews from camp stores, amassing significant personal wealth, while others did not. SS wives who went to Auschwitz, like SS auxiliaries, were elite members of Nazi German society who joined their spouses in their effort to expand Germany, exploit the local population, and to eradicate the Jews of Europe. Let's now turn to the experience of women prisoners in Auschwitz. To enter Auschwitz-Birkenau as an inmate was to enter another world. It meant an end to living in the normal sense. Nothing in their prior experience had prepared them. Irmgard Müller recalled violence, shock, and bewilderment. Any hope was crushed forever when the train reached its destination. The arrival at the ramp was the most shocking experience of my life. There were guns pointed at us all around, and a pandemonium of warning shots, shouted orders, barking dogs, and the screams of terrorized families being torn apart. Approximately a year later, in early summer 1944, Agi Rubin reached Auschwitz in one of the final waves of Hungarian deportations. The impression was unbelievable. There were these striped clothes people, dogs, German soldiers, and it was very, very chaotic. Things just happened so quickly, you didn't have a chance to think or to know what's happening to you or what's awaiting you. Jews disembarking from trains found an incomprehensible environment in which the vast majority would be killed and the lucky few, it's in quotation marks, the lucky few transformed into prisoners. About 90%, somewhere between 80 and 90% of Jews who arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau were killed immediately in the gas chambers. A torturous murder by cyanide gas, which was preceded by the humiliation of public nudity, deception, and violence. Those selected for admittance to the camp were forced to march to Birkenau from the arrival ramp, which had several locations over the course of the camp's history. Guards beat and abused them along the way. Initiation followed. Helen Stern, on one of the first transports from Slovakia, recalled that they led us into a common bathroom, stripped us of all our clothing, made us stand naked, put us into large tubs. They shaved all our hair everywhere. They gave us uncleaned Russian uniforms. My uniform became my only clothing for the next 10 months. As I looked around, I could not believe what the loss of hair could do to one's looks. Even the prettiest of us. They then registered us, and from that moment on until after the war, I became nothing but number 2282. While the procedure was similar and degrading for men and women, camp initiates experienced these violations in gender-specific ways. For many young women, this was their first experience being naked near men. The SS men often were sexually suggestive, verbally abusive, and touched women on their exposed body parts. These violations, paired with loss of hair and a cessation of menstruation shortly after arrival, marked a profound loss of femininity. Women experience the process as sexualized violence and violation. The entire Auschwitz camp complex was a location of mass death. The situation for women was even worse than for men. Rudolf Höss, the first commandant of Auschwitz, acknowledged after the war, everything was much more difficult, harsher, and more depressing for the women, since general living conditions in the women's camp were incomparably worse. They were far more tightly packed, and the sanitary and hygienic conditions were notably inferior. Ilse Michel, an assimilated middle-class Jewish woman from a small town in Germany, claimed, "There are no words in any vocabulary to describe Birkenau. The stench, the dirt, the lice, the diarrhea, the hunger, the despair, the agony, the hatred, the beatings, and death." This well-documented litany was exacerbated by hard labor, which included demolition of Polish homes, draining swampland to make it agriculturally productive, farming and animal husbandry, and road construction. Deadly conditions and overwhelming terror pushed each prisoner to focus on survival. Prisoners who survived beyond the first several months developed tactics to combat annihilation. They utilized practical, psychological, and social strategies. Some scholars have seen significant differences in coping mechanisms used by men and women. My research indicates that women and men employed similar strategies. Men and women alike shared stories, recipes, and religious observances. They tried to wash themselves. They slowed down work when possible and struggled to protect themselves and loved ones from violence. They stole needed items from the SS, they undertook to help each other, and they forged social bonds. Most of the specific strategies looked remarkably similar. Relationships between prisoners, however, varied by gender. While women tended to form groups based on family structures, for example, camp mothers, sisters, and sometimes brothers or fathers or sons, men tended to bond in pairs or trios. Men and women alike saw going it alone as a virtual death sentence. Still, prisoner responses did not yield a primarily positive effect. In other words, these strategies were no guarantee for survival. Sexualized violence began as soon as a woman prisoner entered the camp. Pregnancy, if obvious upon a woman's arrival, sentenced her immediately to death in the gas chambers. She would be one of the people selected. For women, initiation involved as I mentioned before, involves forced public nudity, shaving of all body hair, and body cavity searches, all frequently accompanied by leering men who sexually insulted or groped them. Women experienced these actions as an assault on their bodies, and many feared further sexual assault. Pregnancy was usually a death sentence for mother and child, even if it went unnoticed upon arrival. Annie Sussman, a Jehovah's Witness from Austria, was 6 months pregnant when she arrived in Auschwitz in August of 1944. A short while later, SS men requested that pregnant women register. She did not, and those who did were murdered. When she eventually gave birth, an SS doctor learned of it and killed her infant. Female doctors in the prisoner population could help expectant mothers survive by killing their child or fetus. For them, it was an expression of humanity. They saved one life. Despite their anguish and horror, they concluded this was the only ethical action, or the least unethical action, under these circumstances. Menstruation caused anxiety. Women who continued to menstruate experienced fear, discomfort, and violence. Most prisoners ceased menstruating, however, due to starvation and malnutrition. They feared the Nazis had damaged their reproductive capacity, a fear grounded in hearsay, experience, and observation. Several SS doctors conducted medical experiments on inmates carried out with total disregard for their well-being, and many died or were killed. And my colleague, Dr. Tiara Masnik, will be speaking to you more about this tomorrow, I believe. In his final book, The Drowned and the Saved, Primo Levi identified prisoner functionaries as occupying a gray zone, this is a quote, gray zone poorly defined, where the two camps of masters and servants both diverge and converge, end of the quote. Scholars have used the concept of gray zone to analyze many aspects of the Holocaust. They've seen the gray zone as a male phenomenon, exemplified by Jewish councils and the Sonderkommando, male Jewish prisoners tasked with operating the crematoria. Inside the camps, accepting the Sonderkommando, the gray zone has been viewed as primarily Gentile, with Jews acquiring privilege only at a very late date. Consistently, scholars have viewed those inhabiting the gray zone as complicit and as incapable of engaging in solidarity or morality, and as of having abandoned their humanity. The behavior of privileged prisoners has been particularly confounding, especially regarding Jews who seem to have adopted the goals of the National Socialist regime. And these are perceptions, and I'll talk about those in a minute. What becomes evident from study of the women's camp is that some Jewish women acquired privileged positions very shortly after the founding of the women's camp, that they assumed such roles as a means of survival, and that the relationship to camp authorities was one of complexity, not simply complicity, or even primarily complicity. Anna Binderova, a political prisoner from Prague who had been in Ravensbrück, this is the central concentration camp for women in Germany, since early February of 1942, was on the first transport of women from Ravensbrück to Auschwitz. She and nearly 1,000 other Gentile prisoners were to serve as the prisoner administration. So this group of women arrived before the group of women from Slovakia that Heather McAdam-Dune talked about yesterday. So Binderova and nearly 1,000 other they were to serve in the prisoner administration, supervising common prisoners, many of them Jews. Accompanying Binderova's group were approximately 24 women guards from Ravensbrück. Three things became obvious pretty quickly. The thousands of women prisoners were too many for the space allotted. There were too few Gentile functionaries to oversee the internal operation of the camp, and the SS matrons the SS women guards were incapable of managing. This provided an opportunity for prisoners, including Jewish prisoners, who filled the organizational vacuum, landing work that offered better conditions. Katerina Singarova, known as Katya, and Helen Spitzer, who was known as Zippy in the camp, arrived in Auschwitz from Slovakia together on the second transport of Jewish women. As 1942 began, the Slovakian government, and you all learned some of this yesterday, as the Slovakian government sought to rid the country of Jews, and Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, in a desperate need of labor, agreed to accept Jewish workers. In early March 1942, the Slovakians issued a call for young unmarried Jewish women and men between the ages of 18 and 35 to report for labor duty. Katya and Zippy were among them. They spent several sedentary days at a point of concentration in Slovakia. Zippy approached a distraught Katya, then unknown to her, and chastised her. Weeping could not help. Katya insisted that someone had made a mistake. She was not a Jew. To the Nazis, however, she was. Her parents had been born Jewish, and there was nothing to be done about it. Katya and Zippy struck up an enduring friendship. Zippy initially toiled outside in treacherous conditions, doing building demolition until a chimney collapsed on her. She could no longer do the work required. She reached out to one of the prisoner functionaries brought from Ravensbrück, who found her a new assignment. Zippy, a trained graphic artist, was put in charge of painting a red stripe down the back of prisoner uniforms. While Zippy avoided any position that entailed power over other prisoners, Katya had no such qualms. She became a block senior, responsible for oversight of a single barrack. Zippy and Katya claimed later that anyone there at that time could have gotten a similar job. Thus, from very early on, Jewish women found better jobs and prisoner functionary positions. Zippy narrowly avoided death by vying for an inside job after her injury, and Katya became a block leader. Nearly half of the women from Slovakia and other regions of Europe who arrived that summer of 1942 were not so lucky. They succumbed to the deadly conditions in Auschwitz. While securing a privileged position did not guarantee survival, it was a prerequisite for it. Most women prisoners, whether they arrived in 1942 or 1944, were forced to work outside in all types of weather, performing strenuous labor, which exacerbated the effects of starvation, filth, sleep deprivation, overcrowding, and violence. Most Jewish women died. Gentile women were not immune, but conditions were ameliorated slightly by several factors. They were not subjected to genocidal selections after early 1943. They could communicate with family who could, on occasion, send them packages of needed items, including food, and the SS sometimes chose them for less debilitating work. A good job typically, and that's in quotation marks, a good job typically meant work inside, in a building or within the camp itself, although some of those subcamps that I mentioned earlier did provide some better living conditions. Indoor or working conditions. Indoor work protected a prisoner from exposure to the elements, cold, heat, rain, snow. A job inside the camp meant avoiding forced marches to and from work sites that drained prisoners' already depleted energy. A work assignment might give a prisoner greater access to food or entail work that was less physically demanding. In some cases, their positions changed less frequently than for those who toiled in outside commandos. Some labor details included all or several of these advantages. Prisoners coveted such work assignments, even though some entailed difficult or disgusting tasks such as factory work or latrines cleaning. Favored work assignments included kitchen duty, sorting goods stolen from arriving transports, factory forced labor, scientific experimentation, office tasks, work in infirmaries, and processing new arrivals. The other path to privilege was through official functions, work supervision, oversight of the camp and living quarters, and camp administration. The first two entailed management of other prisoners. The latter did so only rarely and for relatively few. Capos were prisoner functionaries who oversaw work assignments. Typically, cordons of male guards surrounded work details to prevent escape. A single camp guard led each work detail, and capos supervised smaller groups of prisoners. Capos ensured that prisoners labored continuously, maintained pace and discipline during marches to work sites, and when slowed, they meted out punishment. Excuse me. Other prisoner functionaries were responsible for the women's camp and the barracks. Camp seniors, the highest prisoner position, oversaw entire sections of the women's camp, readying inmates for roll call, cleaning the main camp, food distribution, and the division of prisoners into work units. Block seniors oversaw individual barracks. They're also known as blokovas, block El Testa. They supervised and disciplined women prisoners while they during the night and during lockdowns. They inspected barracks, bunks, prisoner uniforms, distribution of food, and other duties. Bunk seniors, Stuben El Testa, Stubova, supervised individual bunks within a barrack. A woman guard affiliated with the SS oversaw each block. She chose the block senior, who in turn chose those who reported to her. So this was one way that women prisoners could help families and friends by installing into some of these positions that were underneath them. Pardon me. Work assignments, so these privileged work assignments and these functionary positions led to envy and resentment unintentionally. Just regular work assignments led to envy and resentment, unintentionally resulting in interpersonal friction. Official functions like capos and block seniors and so on, they were actual part of an SS effort to divide and control the prisoner population. So there was this unofficial way that prisoners were divided from each other, and then quite an official effort to keep prisoners to prevent prisoner solidarity. Other distinctions among prisoners stemming from nationality, educational level, and other characteristics external to Auschwitz exacerbated these hostilities. In most cases, this served the interests of the SS. Pardon me. Assuming a privileged position distinguished an Auschwitz inmate, it caused others to view her as part of the camp hierarchy, as complicit with the SS. Prisoner workers who processed newly arrived women and their belongings exemplify how even unintentional privilege helped undermine SS prisoner solidarity and divert attention from their overarching meaning the SS's overarching responsibility for camp conditions and genocide. Women prisoners registered, tattooed, and cut the hair of new arrivals. This was actually first done by men and later done by women prisoners. New prisoners wondered how older prisoners could contribute to their dehumanization. Helen Waterford recalled that a prisoner forced her to disrobe in front of male guards. The one who stripped me took at the same time my wedding band off my finger. I still thought they were Germans. I did not understand that they were Jewish prisoners. Rosalia Laux from Czechoslovakia experienced what she perceived as intentional abuse at the hands of one of the women who processed her, one of the women prisoners. I know that she came with the first transport of women to Auschwitz, and at the point at which we came, that she must have been very bitter because she lost everybody. She felt that we have to go through the same kind of suffering that her group did, and she was inflicting the pain on us. Polish prisoner Pelagia Lewinska thought otherwise. Hundreds of thousands of women passed under her shears. She was exhausted, and her weary hands kept dropping to her sides. She became incapable of properly cutting hair, although it was a simple matter of shearing everything to the roots. Initiation stood out as a traumatic moment of transition from citizen of the world to denizen of Auschwitz. The conveyors of this transition, other prisoners, were perceived as the primary agents of this transformation, and therefore as part of the camp administration. New arrivals conflated these prisoners with camp authorities. Common prisoners had an even more difficult time understanding prisoner functionaries with direct supervisory responsibilities. When a fellow prisoner, particularly someone who was not German, meted out punishment, the impact on the internees was more devastating than violence inflicted by camp personnel. Regina Laux decried the abuse she received from a compatriot. But it wasn't so much the fear for my life, but the humiliation that she was not German, you see. I had already accepted that anything that had to do with the Nazis was dreadful and to be avoided, but the source was different. It was coming from a Czech woman that the humiliation was double because I had not yet accepted that aside of the Nazis, there were other people who could do that. So I was it destroyed me. Pelagia Lewinska, whom I mentioned before, agreed. It was the appointed inmates who were our immediate superiors. The extent of their power over us was so great that it weighed more heavily on us than the German power behind it. Capos, these are the supervisors of work details, exemplify how the SS exploited the official prisoner hierarchy. The brutality of most capos seems to convey not only an enthusiasm for personal power over other prisoners, but also an affinity for the Nazi project of genocide. Women prisoners experienced as much, if not more, violence at the hands of capos than from SS guards. Almost all survivor testimony and memoirs mention such violence as expected and unexceptional. Kappa's participation in supervisory activities and ruthlessness caused women under them to believe they were an extension of the camp administration, that their beliefs coincided with those of the Nazis, and that they had become like their captors. In general, prisoner functionaries who oversaw the internal camp treated the inmates as poorly as the Kapos did. Helen Stern remembered that our Black elders were three sisters, the Zimmerspitz girls from Slovakia. These girls were very mean to us. When they were to wake us, they came with huge wooden clubs and they swung them at us in our bunks. They had the power to assign us to the gas chamber if they happened not to like anything about us. Prisoners who worked in the camp administration as secretaries and couriers also came to be seen by average prisoners as extensions of, and therefore in collusion with the SS. Some scholars have agreed. They characterize prisoner functionaries in two ways: as sharing the values and goals of the SS, or as having regressed to adolescence, becoming dependent on the SS. These two ideas can be true only in part. In short, this narrow view is mistaken. The situation for prisoner functionaries was much more complex. Functions and privilege advanced individual survival. In fact, assuming such a position was the only way for a prisoner to improve her negligible chance to endure. In order to sustain their privilege, prisoner functionaries had to at least appear to forward the goals of the camp administration. The SS men and women who ran the camp also encouraged violence from supervisory functionaries and threatened punishment if they were not sufficiently vicious. Some prisoners enjoyed the privilege and surrogate power such violence demonstrated. Some may indeed have taken on the mindset or perspective of the camp SS, that some prisoners were subhuman and deserving of violence and death. In these situations, the goals of the individual and the SS coalesce, but they were not identical. Degrees of brutality and violence varied depending on situation, individual personality, and perspective, among other factors. In other words, prisoner functionaries in supervisor positions were not all violent and were not violent all of the time and in every situation. Orly Reichert, even though Gentile, serves as an example in this regard. Reichert, a long incarcerated German political prisoner, eventually became one of the camp seniors in charge of an entire section of the women's camp. Sarah Nomber-Pritchik, a Polish Jewish survivor, observed the following about Reichert. This is a quote. I always saw her in a variety of situations, and in each situation she was a different person. On one occasion, she would be defiant to the authorities. On another, she would be cruel to the prisoners. At one moment, she was filled with compassion for human suffering. At another, without blinking an eye, she made sure that not even one of the victims to the gas chamber would escape. On some days, she was comradely with anyone who was fighting for freedom, no matter what the person's nationality. Yet there were times when she would isolate herself from the rest of us because it was her duty to support the German cause. That's the end of the quote. To a prisoner who did not share Reichert's position in the camp, her behavior seemed erratic and inexplicable. It is possible from our perspective, these many years later, however, to imagine that Reichert was defiant to authorities with whom she had good rapport, helpful to her friends and cruel to others. She may have been brutal or fake brutality when authorities were present, but kind or at least nonviolent when they were not. The women, sorry, the women who worked in Canada illustrate the point. Canada was the term prisoners applied to the area of the camp where slave laborers sorted goods stolen from arriving transports of Jews. The SS forbade prisoners from taking any items from Canada, but many of the prisoners who worked there smuggled needed goods into the camp for their own and others' benefit. Such contraband included food, clothing, thread, and medication. The thriving black market in Auschwitz was supplied almost entirely by goods from Canada, and prisoners who worked there risked their lives to bring them into the camp. Improved circumstances brought greater opportunity to help others. That some privileged prisoners engaged in resistance activity further underscores the divergent perspectives of those with privilege and camp authorities and undermines the notion that functionaries operated exclusively as an extension of the camp administration. Beginning in 1943, dozens of women inmates toiled in an armaments factory in the vicinity of the Auschwitz main camp. This is the Union factory. So for several months in the middle of 1944, some of these women engaged in a successful effort to smuggle gunpowder from the factory to members of the Sonderkommando through a connection, another woman prisoner who worked in Canada. Zippy and Katya, the two women that I mentioned earlier, compiled lists of women prisoners for the SS, which had to be numerically precise. After camp selections, they submitted prisoner numbers of women to be sent to the gas chambers. When they could, they inserted numbers of women who had already perished in place of those who remained alive. In this way, they saved some women, at least temporarily. These privileged prisoners, smugglers and number changers, risked their lives on behalf of others imprisoned in the Auschwitz complex. Even functionaries who did not engage in resistance did not actively forward the Nazi agenda. The Zimmerspitz sisters, who identified earlier as violent and abusive functionaries, point to this conclusion. The sisters stuck together and used their privilege to help one another to the exclusion of others. Still, they hoped for the end of the war and the demise of the Nazis, as evidenced by a poem discovered by the SS that one of them had penned. The Gestapo sent all four sisters to Block 11 in the main camp, where they were questioned and shot. Individually, privileged prisoners were as expendable as any other prisoner. They remained vulnerable to the power and whim of the SS. And I will end with the following. Most prisoners, the vast majority Jews who were admitted to the women's camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau, experienced an environment of unremitting violence, extreme deprivation, and social and physical annihilation. A small number of prisoners were placed in positions that permitted them a minimal degree of autonomy created by access to space, material goods, personal hygiene, or power. For a long time, historians have believed that Jewish women only rarely occupied such positions, and that if they did, they acquired them only in the last year or so of the camp's existence. On the contrary, some Jewish women found their ways into positions of privilege within months, if not weeks, of the camp's founding, the women's camp founding. Indeed, the only Jewish women to survive Auschwitz who arrived prior to the summer of 1944 and were not transferred to another camp occupied privileged positions. Their behavior, sometimes callous and brusque, sometimes brutally violent, seemed to point to a contempt for other prisoners that paralleled that of the Nazi camp personnel. However, their actions often indicate a complex perspective that aimed towards survival, not complicity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So do you have any time for questions by chance?
Oh yeah, I've
Yeah.
got plenty of time. Yeah, however much. And I should say, there are a couple of topics I didn't go into a great deal of detail about. So we could talk about, sexual violence, sexuality, sexual barter, things like that. But I'm also interested in just hearing what other people are interested in talking about.
Okay, and this is actually anybody who's online, I'm gonna let you unmute. So I don't know if Lee or if anybody wants to be able to add to this, add to the conversation. Uh, Questions? Yeah.
I'm
And by the way, this is your time. For many of you that have certain thoughts on this, I really think this is a place to ask, and you'll get questions. There'll probably be answers that are probably the most valid answers you will get. So if you have questions before this is the time to ask these questions.
I was going to ask if research and studies of sexual violence toward women in the Holocaust is relatively new, and if there was historically, or at least in the 80s and 90s, a taboo about doing that type of research.
Yeah, it is relatively new. I would say the 80s and 90s are when people started to think about and ask those questions. That's when feminist historians started to ask sort of general questions about where were women, what was happening to women. There was quite a bit of discussion about whether women, like all women, were victims of the Nazis, or whether some women were part of the perpetrator nation, and then perpetrator behaviors and activities. And then also they started to ask questions about sexualized violence. I would say that there really has been more of a burgeoning around that in probably the last 20 years or so, so in the early part of the 21st century. And understand, so looking into, so for a long time, people thought that they took seriously, for some reason, this idea that German men wouldn't rape Jewish women or other women because of the prohibition against racial defilement. What we can what we can see, what historians have found and scholars have found, though, is that there was evidence of fairly extensive sexualized violence against Jewish women in the killing fields in Eastern Europe. I've seen some evidence of it in camp context. It's not, I would say, not as much as in the killing fields. The killing fields were, special places where violence and sexuality were rampant, and it was very, the people who were assaulted sexually and otherwise were killed within. So there was no, very few people who could survive to actually testify about it. In the camps, there's, I would say, less, generally speaking, sexualized violence from the SS, but there is some evidence of it. And again, most of the people who were, I would say that's like outright sexual assault. There are other forms of sexualized violence that took place, tried to describe. I think there's the initiation process was something that women experienced as sexual violence, and they certainly felt threatened that some kind of rape or sexual assault might happen throughout their time there. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. So yes, it's more recent development. Yes, there is some evidence that sexualized violence by German men against Jewish women happened. I should also mention that there was a brothel in Auschwitz. The brothel was meant for privileged male prisoners. So Jewish men were not permitted to go there, and the women who were, I call it sexual enslavement, uh, who were sexually enslaved in the brothels, were not known to be there. There may have been a Jewish woman here or there, but they did not recruit or conscript Jewish women, knowingly recruit Jewish women into those roles. I hope that was somewhat coherent. Did I answer your question?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Anybody online?
Oh, excuse me, I have a question. Hi. This may be a stupid question only because I'm taking this course for more so my deepening my knowledge and understanding of this time period. But at any point in time, did the Jewish men and women interact within the camps at all?
Yeah, so there in Auschwitz, rarely. There were some places occasionally where male and women and female prisoners interacted. There were sort of groups of skilled male laborers, which included Jewish men, who were, locksmiths, plumbers, carpenters, and so on. And they would occasionally go into sections of the women's camp and would interact with them there. There were some interactions in some of the in other parts of the camp, like in the sauna in the Canada section of Auschwitz, and when they did interact, there were, attempts to communicate. There was sometimes some sexual activity. Um, People had sort of, boyfriends and girlfriends, and what that meant was different in different contexts. So some people actually had, access to some space where they could engage in sexual activity. Other people, just exchanged, I shouldn't say just, they exchanged letters or communications and that kind of thing. So what a relationship looked like between male and female prisoners varied. And I should remind you that so not all of the prisoners in Auschwitz were Jewish. So there was interaction also occasionally between Gentile and Jewish men and women. And relationships developed sometimes there as well. There were two. We can talk about escape. There were two. There was one escape attempt that was by a Jewish woman and a Polish Gentile man. That this couple was caught and they were executed in front of the male and female prisoners. And then there was another another Jewish woman, Gentile Polish man who escaped and they actually got away. So those kinds of relationships also were not they were not, they did happen occasionally.
Okay. Thank you so much. Because or when I hear or when we watch, I think of, just a whole section for the men, a whole section for the women. And once they're on the property, they're never, they never speak. They never see each other, nothing, regardless of it being for relationship or not, just, that's just what I
Yeah.
assumed.
So there were, I
Mhm.
mean, there was in most of Auschwitz, there was gender segregation and there were, there were boundaries between those sections, but they were porous, they were kind of porous boundaries. And I should also say there were two sections of Birkenau that were family camps. One was the camp for Romani people. And the other was the Terzine family camp. And so obviously the Roma family camp was included Roma people, men and women. They were in different. Actually, no, that's not true. They were. I think that group was allowed to live as family groups, but in the Terzine family camp, those were Jewish men and women, and they slept in different barracks, but they could interact with each other inside the confines of that particular section of Birkenau.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Oh, and let me go back to the previous question. I should say, so I didn't talk very much about sexuality and sexual activity. I think some important things to remember is that some women in Auschwitz engaged in sexual barter with sometimes male prisoners Sometimes, so there was lesbianism. There's some indication that there was lesbianism in Auschwitz, and that was so there, I should say there was lesbian behavior. There were probably a small number of women who identified as lesbian. There were people who were sort of opportunistic, and they used it either as part of a sexual barter, or because there were no men around, and they wanted to engage. They wanted to be sexual in some way. Um, uh, and then I also should say that there were women perpetrators of sexualized violence against male prisoners, but also against female prisoners. So I think what I wanted to say about sexuality and sexual violence is that it's complicated, that looking at it from the outside, it can be hard to understand what's going on in a situation. So there certainly was, various levels of coercion, various levels of consent, various degrees of, pleasure and violence involved in sexual activity. And we can go into more detail if you want. I see somebody else said they had a question. I don't know who's next.
Victor, you can ask.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, somebody else is calling. Any of the SS women after the war, were they brought to trial, or were any of them, was anything mentioned about them, or were they seen as not the same perpetrators as the male
That's a good
SS
question.
guards?
So sometimes they were seen as worst perpetrators. So yeah, there were some women. So women comprised about 10% of the Guard Corps, and they also comprised about 10% of the people brought to trial. So uh, there's a so so women were brought to trial. There was a Ravensbrück trial, and there were obviously women guards in that one. There were a number of women guards at Ravensbrück. It was the main women's camp. So they were put on trial there. There were a number of women defendants in the Bergen-Belsen trial, and that transcript is available online. It's entirely in English, and I believe the Ravensbrück trial is also in English. I'm not sure if it's available online, but the Bergen-Belsen one definitely is. Irma Grasso was among the defendants at Bergen-Belsen, and she was vilified. I mean, she was sort of seen as she was called, the beautiful beast and so on, and she was executed. There was a lot of, I think, regarding her anyways, there was a lot of kind of salaciousness attached to her person as a perpetrator, as a sort of someone who was perceived as pretty, and then the degree of violence that was evidenced by testimony against her. And she became this sort of, I think, sort of outsized symbol of female perpetrators, and she was characterized by sort of sexual depravity and so on. And she was executed. I don't quite remember how many other. I think there were a couple of other women who were executed as a result of the Belsen trial. Um, uh, then Maria Mandel, who was one of the leaders of the one of the head women guards in Auschwitz, she was tried by the Poles and she was executed. Um, so I think one of the things I would say is that there was, I think, this a sort of um, an expectation, I guess, by both prisoners and perhaps prosecutors after the war that women wouldn't have been violent in similar kinds of ways to men. Um, And I would say they weren't. I mean, women were never tasked with the project of genocide. They were not said you need to go kill Jews. And there were certainly men who had that task. Some of them found different ways to participate. Some of them by being violent, and some of those violent women were brought to trial, and there was evidence against them from prisoners. There are other groups, though. Very few SS wives were brought to trial. I think there's one notorious one, Elsa Koch, who was at I think Buchenwald. She was brought to trial, and there was a lot of salaciousness around her trial as well. But other than her, very few wives were brought to trial. I'm not aware of any of the communication specialists that were ever brought to trial. Um, these were highly committed Nazi women. And I would say that the women guards were probably sort of less doctrinally committed to Nazism, but had much more opportunity to be violent. So they were tried. And so I guess I would argue, like, I see the wives and the communication specialists as, in some ways, more responsible for the sort of, at least, partial success of the Nazi genocide than women camp guards. But they were never, because they weren't violent, they were never perceived that way. I very much see them as desk murderers, as people who were important, really important cogs in the wheel. And I see the guards as kind of the low level violent people who are the ones in almost the kinds of people who in almost any society are the ones who get sort of, caught. I don't know if I explained that very well, but that's kind of how I perceive it.
No, go ahead, Mitch.
Okay. I have a question for you about a relatively early work from the history of Auschwitz, but seems a little bit obscure, written by a guy who wrote, his name was Yehiel Denur, but he wrote under the pen name of Katsetnik. And he wrote about sexualized violence in Auschwitz and forced prostitution much, much earlier than other people had done so, but it seemed very sensationalized. And I was wondering, can you comment on that book and his take on the subject in Auschwitz?
So I have the book. It's sitting in my stack of books over here, and I actually haven't read it. So I'm going to say about hearsay. My understanding is also is that it's sensationalized. So what I'll do is I'll read that in the next couple of weeks, and I'll get back. I'll write a better answer for you. But my understanding is that book is all centered around sexualized violence, and I would say I wouldn't say that that's the primary experience of women in Auschwitz. I would say fear of sexual assault, fear and terror of all different kinds of violence were absolutely there all the time. But an idea of women being like in that, particularly Jewish women being in sexualized slavery in Auschwitz would be really unusual.
Yes, and he made claims in the book that I've never seen made anywhere else, and it was such an early publication that I wondered if maybe there was some other motive in the publication than what came later as a result of scholarly research.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. He could be. He's an early writer. I mean, there's another writer, Olga Lengil, who also has quite a bit of sort of like, again, some sort of like what some people have characterized as sort of pornographic aspects of her work, and I think the House of Dolls, the Katzednik book, is like that as well. And it could be, some people have analyzed Olga Lengil's work as needing to call attention to sort of experiences that were happening but were not necessarily common, but she wanted people to know that women were having experiences that were different from men's experiences. And also one of the places that she published, I don't think this is true of Katzednik, but she was publishing in I think in men's journals, and so sort of I think may have felt pressure to include some of these sort of pornographic elements to it. And certainly there's, I would say, some pornographic elements around the trial of Irma Gresa. So, and then of course there's been like a whole line of sort of pornographic engagement with female perpetrators of the Holocaust. So there's, I think, a kind of a weird I don't know what exactly the word is, but I think that I think this is one thing that I definitely think is that female sexuality is something that people have a really, really difficult time with. And so looking at it looking at it in any kind of objective way is it's just not it's not there in fictional representations of the Holocaust. It's rarely there in scholarly analyses of the Holocaust. People are just very reluctant to sort of talk about female sexuality, and so it gets really distorted, in my opinion. And I think that Kadzednik's book is probably one of those situations.
All right, anybody else got any questions? I think that's all of our questions, Dr. Cushman. I really appreciate you taking your time today. Anybody else online, real quick? Romario?
Yes, I have a question. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was a very enlightening paper. I bet during the process of doing the research and stuff, you had to dig a lot, do a lot of research, and find out with a lot of uncomfortable facts, things that are very hard to face, or that once you find them, maybe making those claims or making them know might not good appear pleasing or give a good look, especially when we study history. Sometimes there are situations where we think that it's so easy to come up with what is the good side and what is the bad side. And there are so many situations in which both sides overlaps, and all that is also part of our history as humans. Like, we're not perfect, we're not all good 100% good, but not always 100% bad either. So just having said that, I was wondering, like, what kind of pushbacks, criticisms and rejections have you faced while doing your research?
Not I myself, not too much. In the early years, so back in the 80s, 90s, women who were feminist scholars who started asking questions about where women were and what they were doing and so on, really got quite a lot of pushback about talking about sexual violence, and then also just this idea that women had a significantly different experience. And then there's some people who and my work is mostly about women in Auschwitz, and I talk about a lot of different facets of that. And so I think because I'm not focused solely on these kind of places where sort of, people might have, in what in retrospect we might think of as, compromised themselves or whatever, like that hasn't been, it's been woven into my work. And so it's not so it's been, I would say, probably difficult for people to attack. So people haven't gone after me for that particular kind of thing. There's other people who focus in on specific things, like people who focus specifically on sort of lesbianism or sexualized violence, that when especially when those topics first appeared in the scholarship, that they got a lot of pushback. But I personally have not gotten a lot of pushback.
Is that anybody else? Yeah, that is all. Dr. Cushman, thank you for spending your afternoon with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you for all your time and your insight, and for sharing your work.
Thank you so much, and I really do appreciate you all, and the work that you do in the classroom. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. All right. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.